right, how's everybody doing? Hot out there? It's hot in Vancouver. We're gonna dive into an interesting topic tonight. I've chosen to look at transboundary environmental assessment, sustainability without borders. Okay, so this is pretty relevant to a lot of things happening in the world right now. Obviously, one major thing is a pandemic, which doesn't know any boundaries or borders. But that's not the only thing. There's a lot of other things that don't. First, why do we need to think about this? Why do you think it's important? Why is this an issue? Post-COVID world? Sure. What else? What about pre-COVID? This isn't new. I'm going to show you stuff that's like 20, 30, 40 years old. What else? Climate change does not have borders. Exactly. That's one thing. Big impacts from travel industries. Sure. What else though? Water resources float. There we go. That's a good one. Exactly. If you think about it, water resources, watersheds often cross boundaries. Local issues can become global ones for sure. Regulatory systems are different, right? So regulations, environmental impact assessment is driven by regulations. That's what EIA is really about, a bunch of regulations. That's essentially what it's all about. And therefore, in different political jurisdictions, you're going to have different regulations. Impacts that occur somewhere else may have impact. Ooh, that's a good one. And we're going to have a really good example of that. So yeah, Kristen hit it pretty good there. So things such as the migration of different impacts, the accumulation of impacts, so cumulative effects, just the fluid nature of some of the impacts that we see. We have to account for all this stuff. We need to think about it. It doesn't happen within our own little village or our own city or our own province or our own nation state. A lot of these things can cross borders of various sorts. And therefore we have to think about that, and then we have to have ways of dealing with that. And that's what this is about that whole process. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that tonight and give you a high level view, but some of the things that are important to know about. Okay. All right. So we've said, so what might happen? So what are the things that might happen that this means we have to act on? Well, like what if there's an oil spill that happens between different nation states, right? Exxon Valdez, good one. The Gulf of Mexico one. There's a lot of different oil spills that have occurred that have impacted different countries. Water contamination. Water contamination can go cross borders quite easily. Air pollution. Air pollution is probably the one that is the most fluid because air sheds can be massive, right? And it depends. Chernobyl, there's a good example. And Chernobyl is a really good example. Volcanic eruptions, right? Noise pollution, you can get noise going across boundaries as well at low frequencies and so forth. This is a bunch of different impacts that can cause us to have some sort of trans-border or transnational framework in place. So we know that this is an issue, but when did it become apparent? I imagine it became apparent eons ago when you had primitive villages and then something was happening in one village that somehow affected the other one, right? But some of the earliest modern ones where regulations have caught up and basically resulted from that have been major global events that have had global impact. So one was already listed here, Chernobyl. What's another one? Major event. Fukushima was pretty major, but not as major as this is what I'm talking about. This happened in the, so it's quite a while ago, but it's actually famous by atmospheric scientists. Like this became kind of a godsend for atmospheric science, meteorology. Someone mentioned it, volcanic eruption, right? So which is the big one that happened in the 90s? There's one actually in the United States, but this is not the one I'm talking about. Starts with P. One, Mount Pinatubo. Nope, this one, you should know about this one. If you're in the environment field, you should know about Mount Pinatubo. Mount Pinatubo was a really big eruption that happened on June 12th, 1991. And it pushed a lot of particulate matter into the atmosphere. And what's interesting about Mount Pinatubo was that the effects were worldwide. It sent so much particulate matter into the atmosphere that it had a global impact. Impact on temperatures. There's a lot of aerosols in the global atmosphere, and so why I'm saying that Pinatubo was really interesting for atmospheric scientists, because we knew where that came from, and therefore we could see and better understand what global atmospheric processes were, how they were working based on Mount Pinatubo's explosion. So a lot of really good research came out of Mount Pinatubo eruption, as well as being a major catastrophe. But in addition to that, what resulted was this understanding, or not, it didn't result from that, but a reinforcement of the fact that we need to have frameworks in place for events that cross boundaries and borders. Okay? So one of the things that happened as a result of that was the need for some sort of framework to deal with the different the different issues that will result from these transboundary impacts. Okay, and so often in when we're dealing with these kinds of when we deal with these cross-border impacts, it's often done in a multilateral or convention sense. Okay, so we get to have like biodiversity or climate change or things of this nature. They result in some form of international agreement. Okay, and this is exactly what happened with impact assessment. So as a result of these growing transboundary issues, an international convention was developed. Okay, so similar to I've mentioned before, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework on Climate Change, this convention is called the Espoo Convention, ESPOO. Now I think it's pronounced differently. It's Finnish, I think, Espoo. I'm gonna send a link through here for you for the Espoo Convention. I always call it Espoo because that's literally how it's spelled, but I know that I pronounce it wrong. And if you're Finnish, you're probably laughing at me. I'm gonna, yeah, it's a Finnish city. So when these things are developed, these conventions, they're often developed in a city, and therefore they get that convention name. So this literally was developed in Finland. So here's the link to this convention here. Bang. Okay, so this convention, which is a good one to know about, was one that resulted. It's the Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment in a Transboundary Context, the Espoo Convention. So formulated initially by the UN Economic Commission for Europe, the aim of it is to prevent, reduce, and control significant adverse transboundary environmental impacts. So what it is, basically what it outlines is a standardized process of transboundary EIA, right? So similar to how we have environmental impact assessment in Canada, federally or provincially, this outlines a process when there is an environmental impact that literally falls between two nation states, right? So it's a process. So what it does is it provides a concrete framework of procedural regulation. It's like a step-by-step process that they provide that can supplement substantive legal proceedings which do not address transboundary issues. And so when I say there's a difference between procedural and substantive, substantive usually means like the assigning levels of the actual case unto itself, whereas a procedural framework or regulation outlines the process of how to deal with it. So it's more of a guideline of how to walk through, say, negotiating and disputing these cross-border issues. That's a rough explanation of the difference between the two. And the SBU is more procedural in nature. That's what it's all about, is defining procedures. There may be instances in which other international agreements may overlap, so that you may have this covered by climate change or biodiversity in addition to the SBU Convention. But the SBU Convention really talks about the procedures. So the key features of it, 5 key features of this convention, is the procedural character of it. So it's concerned with making proposed activities that are subject to standardized procedures of transboundary environmental impact assessment. So it's about procedural legitimacy. This is about establishing a procedure for dealing with, say, for instance, if France and Germany are having a dispute over some sort of water pollution that started in Germany that impacted France, this would invoke a procedure for them to deal with that, whereas it won't dictate exactly how to deal with the incident itself, but the procedure to address the actual incident, if that makes any sense. So it's provisions of obligations in specified context. So it provides what parties are obliged to do in given specific contexts. There's a requirement of providing public participation. So similar to our Canada's environmental impact assessment legislation, there is a process and procedure that requires there be public consultation in the different parties that are affected. There are mechanisms to ensure implementation. So they have 2 mechanisms, an inquiry procedure and a review of compliance. And they have then also a multilateral agreement on bilaterally structured processes. So what this means, essentially, you probably have heard in the news often federal leaders talking about multilateral processes or bilateral negotiations. This is just a fancy words for when you have a multilateral process. This means you have more than 2 nation states dealing with an issue. There are, say, like the UNFCCC for climate change is a multilateral process because you have many countries dealing with and negotiating carbon emissions limits or processes and procedures for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas bilateral is a process by which you're dealing with 2 nation states, right? So we have a bilateral meeting between Canada and the United States, means we are negotiating whatever it is, a trade deal or something like that, but simply between Canada and the US, not with another country, okay? So this convention outlines those multilateral and bilateral structured processes of how do countries work together. So in essence, the SBU Convention is essentially a framework that allows countries to navigate situations in which we have shared responsibilities pertaining to environmental impacts that cross those boundaries, right? So to learn more about it, you can go to that website and look at some cases and so forth. But I'm giving you kind of a broad sweep of different things that we deal with international or transboundary issues. So another good example of how we're dealing, this is a little closer to home, is with our trading partners, our close trading partners. So who are 2 of our closest trading partners in Canada? What is one? US, China, you could say probably that's true, but I'm thinking of US and Mexico. Yeah, I'm thinking in North America. So what binds America, Canada, and Mexico? What links us? Right, NAFTA and the new, whatever they call it, NAFTA Part 2, right? So we have a trade agreement between these three countries who are sovereign states. What goes along with that, though, is, and in fact, when NAFTA was initially being negotiated, so who was the prime minister at the time that a NAFTA was originally negotiated, the first NAFTA? Who was in power at that time in Canada? Nope. Close. There we go. Dan's got it. Mulroney. Brian Mulroney was the prime minister at the time NAFTA was negotiated. In fact, that's why he was consulted on the negotiation of this new one, and then he chimed in here or there. So Brian Mulroney was responsible for that. In fact, Brian Mulroney is the greenest prime minister in Canadian history. A lot of like really significant environmental stuff happened under when Brian Mulroney was prime minister. Elizabeth May did work for him. That's correct. And she will say that. Elizabeth May will say clearly that Brian Mulroney is the greenest prime minister in Canadian history, which surprises everybody because he's known more as he was a conservative, progressive conservative. But the thing is, the proof is in the pudding. So there's a bunch of stuff that happened, the Montreal Protocol and so forth, and SOx and NOx regulations, acid rain. One of the things, though, was NAFTA, right? So NAFTA was negotiated, but as a provision to NAFTA, to get that trade deal done, there were also concerns about two other things: environmental problems and social problems that are linked to that increase in trade between those three countries, right? So therefore, as a necessity for getting that done, there was a commission was established. So an organization was established to deal with environmental problems associated with between Canada, North America, and the United States. And this is called the CEC. Okay, so has anybody ever heard of the CEC before? Yes, no? Nope. Okay, good to know then. This is an important thing to know about because it's the CEC is the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. So this is very similar type of thing to a global, like an international UN secretariat, except there's only three parties involved. There's the Canadian government, the Mexican government, and the American government are equal or partners in this. So the way it works is each one of those trading partners gives funds to the Secretariat to have it run, and then they deal with, as a council, environmental issues that are concerning to those three parties. This is part of the deal. So it's interesting for our purposes because we deal with a lot of shared issues. So what would be one of the things that we would deal with as a shared environmental problem between and what's a big one, like an obvious one? What's one shared resource that we have? Water, exactly. What specific water though? What bodies of water? Oceans, yes. Great Lakes is the one I'm looking for. Yeah. And St. Lawrence too. So all of that, St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, if you think about it, that's just all shared between the United States and Canada. Okay. So a lot of their work initially was on the Great Lakes. So if you look at their website, the CEC then is involved in a lot of different activities that are pertaining to um, agreement and cooperation on environmental parameters. So in that website there, if you look at that, you'll see there's a lot of this that goes into the agreement itself. So the one thing to look at there are the objectives. So Article 1. So it's all Article 2. These are the different articles in the agreement. So I'm just going to go through Article 1, which are the objectives of the agreement. So the objectives of this agreement are to seek ways to modernize and enhance the effectiveness of environmental cooperation between the parties, that's Mexico, Canada, and the United States, building upon their long history of environmental cooperation. Use environmental cooperation as a means to promote mutually supportive trade and environment policies, including supporting implementation of environmental goals and objectives of the USMCA. So that is the new agreement. Strengthen cooperation between the parties to conserve, protect, and enhance the environment and address environmental challenges and priorities. Promote cooperation on and public participation in the development of environmental laws, regulations, procedures, policies, and practices. And lastly, strengthen cooperation related to the compliance with and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. So if you can go through the rest of that agreement in detail. I'm just going to show you some examples. So I had some colleagues that have worked for the CEC before. I've submitted proposals. I'm familiar with them. Their headquarters is in Montreal, and they do some quite interesting stuff. So I'm just going to show you a couple of their projects that I think are of note. So one of the things that they deal with is transboundary protected areas. So under their work themes, you can see this. Here's one. So this is their ecosystem conservation. So if you go to that website, you'll see what they are doing for conserved areas. Now these ones are largely in between the United States and Mexico, like southern Mexico, Big Bend, Rio Bravo region. So it's in like the Rio Grande area. Another area that they do a lot of work in, and the stuff that I am most familiar with, is their pollutant transport. So if you go to this website here, all of these links will be in the notes too. This is really good stuff, and they've been doing this for quite some time. So they have a what they call the North American Environmental Atlas. So if you click on that one link on that here, so I'll put this through. They've created, and this has been up for a while, I think it's really cool, is they have an atlas. If you go to the map viewer part of that, you can look at different types of pollution and waste and human influence of various sorts and map them, right? So if you can look at the pollution and waste, you can look at here, the one that, so North American power plant emissions, that's on there, marine vessel emissions. The one that I think is quite interesting is the pollutant releases and transfers reporting facilities. So if you click that, you then will be able to see that information on the map. Okay. So they are really involved in looking at all kinds of pollutant transport and so forth across those different borders. One last thing that they do, which I think is also quite interesting and very cool, is their ecosystems and carbon storage. And this is, I think, a newer program that they have. If you look at this last one, this one is where they have developed a North American collaboration ecosystem carbon storage and sources. So this is basically an atlas of different methods and products to monitor continental land cover change. So they have some pretty good publications they've put out on black carbon and integrated modeling and so forth. I'm not sure if they had an atlas, I'm not sure if it's up right now. So they do a lot of this kind of like cross-border work. So they're not necessarily a big regulator, but they are looking at issues and monitoring issues and doing projects that pertain to those different jurisdictions. Okay, so these are 3 examples of different kind of frameworks or legal proceedings that can deal with it, but I want to walk you through one example of why we need this. Okay, so has anybody ever heard of POPs before? POPS. POPs, the doll. No, this is not the doll. POPS stands for persistent organic pollutants. Okay, like those. So these are things like PCBs, Mirex, dioxins, furans, DDT, toxaphene, and so forth. So I'd mentioned them before, like Agent Orange in our previous discussion about war and sustainable development. Those are POPs, persistent organic pollutants. So why are they persistent? Why are those persistent? Why do they call them persistent? Exactly. They don't break down. Often they're highly volatile and they don't easily break down. Often in certain environments, in environments where they can get trapped, like either methylated or they're not in a lot. There's not a lot of energy to break them down, like in cold environments and so forth. So these are when you get these chemicals and they don't break down, what do you think happens to them? They accumulate, exactly. So the three characteristics of POPs are they're lipophilic, so they like lipids. So what does that mean? If something likes lipids, what does that mean? Likes fats, exactly. So it can accumulate in tissue and cells, and that's a problem because that can lead to bioaccumulation. Accumulation not just in an ecosystem, but accumulation in organic matter and species. Bioaccumulation. Another characteristic, they're persistent, right? So, and what persistence leads to, if something's persistent, it doesn't break down. So if something doesn't break down, it sticks around. So if it's lipophilic and persistent, it can biomagnify. So it can magnify because it sticks around, doesn't get broken down, doesn't get metabolized, sticks around, and it can accumulate in concentration in organic matter. Okay? And then thirdly, these often are semi-volatile. So what's the problem with something that's semi-volatile? Easily airborne. Bingo. Something semi-volatile, it easily gets airborne, right? So it can be easily transported. So if something is lipophilic, persistent, and semi-volatile, it means it can bioaccumulate, it can biomagnify, and it can move around, particularly depending if it gets into global transport systems, then we've got a problem. Okay, so those are the characteristics of persistent organic pollutants. I think you probably know where I'm going with this then. So when something biomagnifies, what it means is it basically the concentration of a contaminant will increase across a trophic structure or up a trophic structure. So like for instance, if something is spread widely along the ocean or something like that, it gets uptake by algae, right? And so what happens then? If something's being accumulated by algae and it's a persistent organic pollutant, meaning it's lipophilic and doesn't break down, what would then happen? What eats algae? Exactly. So you get insects, you get smaller microbes, so forth, and those that eaten by the fish, small fish, which are often eaten by larger fish, which the larger fish are eaten by seal, which are then eaten by whales, and then sometimes we either eat the fish or we use what comes from the whale, right? So you can see that those small concentrations of persistent organic pollutants along the bottom of the food chain there start to turn into big problems when you start to look at how they then magnify. So a good example of this is toxaphene. Okay, so there was a problem with a persistent organic pollutant called toxaphene in the Canadian Arctic. So in the air, we get toxaphene concentrations of like about 745 parts per trillion. And then as you start to look at then the precipitation, so snow. So in snow, it went up to 85 to 1700 parts per million. In seawater, 288 parts per million. Zooplankton, 2400, all the way up to a marine mammal where you had like a seal or a fish. So in fish, it was 436,000 parts per trillion. And in marine mammals, it was 480,000. So that's going from a relatively low concentration in the air all the way up to fairly significant concentration in a marine mammal. And so where do you think then the next step goes? What's the next thing we have to look at? People, exactly. So the next step of this is to look at exposure. So you can have a toxin in the environment, but then you need to look at how bioavailable that is. So exposure is, in this case, in the Arctic, we have people still who have a subsistence lifestyle. They're at a high part of the trophic level, and they consume fish, marine mammals, wild bird eggs, and all of those sources are correlated to contaminant levels, high contaminant levels in humans. So you have exposure and you have high toxic level. And the sensitivity part of that, you have exposure and then sensitivity. And you have to look at who is sensitive. So the things that are sensitive are fetuses, the elderly, people with poor health, and children and newborns. So this turned in this particular example, which is known as it's actually a real case, is POPs in China, turned out that some detective work needed to be done, and they established the different pathways of transport. So there were active and passive transport mechanisms or pathways through media such as air, water, land, biota, and people products, through air sheds. So air sheds are not like watersheds because they don't have a fixed geographic boundary. Volume of air sheds can be very big. And then the idea then with this was there needed to be the tracing of the different pathways explicitly. So in this case, the pathways for dioxins were traced to having come from global transport mechanisms. So in this case, when you started to see these dioxins that high in the food chain, they were actually determined to come from China. And the way it works is you get absorption on particles and volatilization, and then transport through global transports, deposition, and then bioaccumulation in the Arctic. Okay, so this then is a very good example of how something that happened in China. So these in this case, these pollutants came from China, as it turned out. And there was the need for having some sort of negotiation. Now, I don't know for sure if the Espoo Convention was used to negotiate this. I don't think it was. But nonetheless, this shows you how you go about assessing or what these problems are that come up that you need to have these global frameworks in place. Okay, so persistent organic pollutants is one, and there's some other ones today that we can discuss. So one other type of transboundary issue that we deal with is actually more relevant to what we're facing today with the pandemic. And this pertains to endangered species. Okay, so my last example of a transboundary issue is related to endangered species. So what is the problem with endangered species? What do we have to worry about, in your opinion? Illegal wildlife trade, exactly. Why though? Well, how does it happen? Poorly upheld international regulations, and then also demand, right? So there are people that demand, or there's a market for endangered species, products that come from endangered species. What would be an example of one of those products? Tiger bone, exactly. Tiger bone, ivory, rhino horn, Exactly. These are the things that really, pangolin, probably, I don't know, but I'm sure it's on the list. So these kind of, and these are transboundary issues when you think about it. Bat meat, yeah, I don't know. I haven't tried to buy bat meat at Whole Foods. Are pangolin scales a big one? I'm sure they are. So all of these things, though, when you think of it, and this is some things people that don't think about. So we have transboundary pollutants, but we also have the movement of endangered species. This is a transboundary issue. It's a transborder environmental impact, really, when you think about it. So how do we deal with that then? How do we attempt to deal with this problem? Exactly, CITES. So for those that aren't familiar with CITES, there is a convention that is supposed to deal with these issues. It's called CITES. It's called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Okay, so CITES, it's an agreement between government partners, and the aim of it is to ensure that the trade of specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. So if you go to that website, you'll get more information about it. And this started, I believe CITES was initially, the discussion was going back to the 1960s, whereas today, obviously, there's a lot more issues pertaining to that. It's not just about the endangered species, but also all the different risks that may come along with that as well, health risks and so forth. So CITES is the body that's responsible for this, and there are then regulatory frameworks in place. And a lot of this has to do with information, right? So we need to have lists of species that are on endangered species lists. So the red list for the IUCN is an often cited list of endangered species. And then CITES has their own list of species that are, are threatened or endangered. So, and this is the list. So you can go, there's photos of all these. So CITES, and this is where we have, their governments have officers and a process in place for tracking violations of CITES. This is not to say that CITES takes care of everything. So I'll give you a personal example. So one time I was crossing a border in Central America. I think it was from Guatemala to Honduras, I think, if I recall. I'm not sure. But there was buses going. I was on a bus, a chicken bus, and they would stop the bus at that border, and the guards would come on. So soldiers came on the bus and searched the entire bus. And what they were looking for were rare birds. And the problem, and this was in the 90s, and I didn't even know about CITES at that point in time. The issue then was that a lot of people would go to the Guatemalan rainforest and the temperate rainforest, and they would capture rare birds. And then they would smuggle them out of Guatemala and attempt to sell them elsewhere in the world. And in some cases, those birds were endangered species. So those soldiers were actually looking for infractions to the CITES Convention to see if any of the birds, and they have animals, so people had chickens and all kinds of stuff on there, but they were looking for exotic birds on that, and they had rifles and stuff, so it was serious. And the idea there is to track and know what's endangered and then cite those infractions when they come up. So CITES is a tool, and in fact, we use CITES all the time now when we're working with countries on tracking infractions and so forth. This is the thing to sell as pets. Happens a lot in Southeast Asia, exactly. So CITES is actually quite an effective means of dealing with it. That's not to say that poaching doesn't still happen and there's not an illegal trade, but this is a convention. It's a way of trying to deal with this across different countries. So CITES, like the other conventions, has parties that agree to it. I think there's 190 some parties to the CITES convention. They regularly meet, they regularly update their lists and examine the different procedures that we require to then deal with this stuff. Okay? So what do you think then, given this kind of snapshot of international EIA, what do you think some of the issues that we need to confront today are then? What are some things that are on our kind of our hot list today? One of the big things that we're having to deal with is not so much it's environmental, but maybe a little more on the human health, disease transfer. Absolutely. That's obviously something that is on the top of our list now. However, I do predict that because of the habitat destruction for sure, the impact of different activities in habitat destruction, on a transboundary basis, yes, for sure. Climate change, so climate forcing and the impact on different cross-boundary issues, sure. Disasters, yes. But disease transfer, I think, is quite an interesting thing to look at, particularly COVID, because we are now becoming, I think, way more aware of the ease by which localized phenomenon can become global very quickly, right? This is something that I think more and more we're going to see more attention being paid to. And that may have a translation into then other global environmental phenomena. So I think plastics is a big issue that we're going to see more attention being paid to, microplastics particularly, the impact of nanotechnologies and so forth. So the agreements that we have in place, some of which I've talked about tonight, such as CITES, but more importantly, the CEC for North America, the ESPO Convention, and different other kind of biodiversity convention, will have to adapt to these new issues that are coming up. Genetically modified species, I think, is another issue that we're more and more have to be concerned with. And so where will we go in the future with this? It's hard to say. I think one of the issues that a lot of people are debating now is whether or not multilateralism is going to work or not. And in fact, we had a question about that last week. I think it was the week before. The thing is, it's not perfect, but we need to do it. So we need to have mechanisms such as these different conventions, which are often procedural in nature, not substantive. They don't tell you specifically what we need to do, but how we do it. We need to have those in place to help negotiate how we move forward. And they will most likely be as important, if not more important, going forward. So there we go. That's the kind of a brief Cole's notes for this topic tonight. I'm going to include these links in the notes, and I think what will be particularly, and some links to some papers and I think the ones for POPs will be the most interesting for you, because that's really, it's Canadian. That was one that actually occurred in the Canadian Arctic, is where that problem came up. And actually, it was really, global emissions, foreign emissions that were causing that problem. All right, does anybody have any questions? Crickets. Yeah, there's a lot to it. I mean, I can only go into so much detail, but I think if you take a look at the notes, that will lead you to some really good papers on this stuff. One thing I didn't talk about was the grasshopper effect. And the grasshopper effect is specific to POPs. And what the grasshopper effect is where you have persistent pollutants that get transported into global processes and then get deposited in certain regions. Like it goes from, say, I don't know, India over to Europe, deposited, but because they're volatile or semi-volatile, they get volatilized. So they get deposited, but they get volatilized again. And they call this the grasshopper effect because they get transported, deposited, volatilized, and then they get transported again. And they pop, pop, pop. But the problem is with these pops, when they get in certain environments, they don't volatilize anymore, right? And the Arctic is one of those environments. That's like that's the end game for a lot of pops, because when they get deposited there, it's so cold that they don't volatilize, so they get stuck there, and then that's where they bioaccumulate. And this is why that became such a big problem, that POPs issue. It was the grasshopper effect, and all of that was documented. I'll put the links in the paper, since Royal Roads worked on that back in the day. That's like in the 90s. Matt Dodd and Steve Grundy and Doug Bright. All right. Thank you for coming out. And if you have any questions on this, shoot me an email, and I will post this as soon as I can. I'm going to try and do it tonight.